everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I want to start by telling you about something that I've been working on for about the last week. I decided that because I have a little more time these days, I'm not traveling like I was, that I would actually make a plan about some sewing. And I'm going to assign some days and a time frame where I'm going to do nothing but sew. I have a tendency to make things kind of random. I end up with miscellaneous pieces in my closet, and then I wonder why things don't go together very well. So I actually made a list. I have a list of things that I already have cut out that I haven't sewn. I have a little list of things to cut out, and just some ideas that I've gathered from magazines and blogs and other social media sorts of things. So my list ended up being sort of long, but I pared it down to about 6 things that I'm really excited about making. And I've decided to take a couple of days off from the actual work that I do here, and I'm going to stay at home, and I'm not going to do the laundry, and I'm not going to wash the dishes, and I'm not going to work in the garden, and I'm going to sew. I'm going to unplug and actually get down to something that I really want to do. Sometimes when I'm really tired and want to sew but don't really feel like getting into it, I will at least walk into my sewing room and clean off the cutting table. That's number one. Sometimes that's all I do. Sometimes I might wind the bobbin, set up the sewing machine, thread the serger, get ready for tomorrow to sew. I might get into it and maybe I'll sew a shoulder seam, and maybe the second seam gets sewn, and maybe a binding gets put on, and all of a sudden I'm into it and I'm not tired anymore and I'm ready to sew. I know a lot of you are sewing a lot these days, and some of you are wanting to sew a lot these days and still not quite getting to it. I really understand that. You can get in funks about sewing. So I'm encouraging you and I'm challenging you that by the time we meet up next Tuesday, that you actually have a list of 4, 5, 6 things that you want to make that work with your wardrobe, and you're planning for the summer, finishing out the summer, you're kind of thinking about a project that you could work long term that maybe has some hand stitching so that you can sit outside and do a little bit of stitching bits at a time. So a plan. I like a plan. I rarely have a plan in my life. I sort of am a reactionary kind of person, but I have a plan. So just a little suggestion. Today we're going to talk about V-neck necklines. And first of all, I want to show you what I have on, which is the latest variation of the no-toe tee. Last Friday we sent out the latest issue, issue 6 of Series 9 of So Confident 2020. It's a beautiful issue, lovely photography of the murals that are painted and done in glass and mosaic work up at No-Toe, which is our arts district in Topeka. That's the name of this piece, actually. We named it for the North Topeka Arts District. And also we interviewed Mandy Patullo, who is my favorite textile collage artist, lives in England. I've had the privilege of taking classes from her. She's answered some questions about her creativity and inspiration. And then the issue also shows some photographs of some of the small collages that I do for my getaway time. And then it also, in the issue, goes into great detail of how to prepare and sew a V-neck. So if you're a So Confident member or want to become a So Confident member, you have the information that I'm going to tell you about today in printed form that you can review in So Confident issue 6. Issue 6, yes. Okay. So I decided to work with the Eureka top. It's been a long-standing favorite pattern of ours for a long time. If you were to just take the pattern out of the envelope, you would get something like this. Now, we've cut this up a little bit, but just imagine a solid piece of fabric in the front, solid piece of fabric in the back, but it does have a round neckline in the pattern, and it has these little sleeve bands that can be folded or not folded. Simple t-shirt, simple top, loose fitting, kind of boxy. It's a great piece to wear either by itself or over a longer tank, under a jacket. It's a wonderful complementary piece. Brianna, who works here, made the Eureka top as a dress. She used the same sleeve length here, didn't alter that, same neckline, and simply lengthened the garment and added this casing and a tie so that she made it into a little tunic or dress. This is in a woven. You can make the Eureka top either in a knit or a woven fabric. Now, coincidentally, she's used a knit for the binding on this woven garment, which I thought was interesting. I think she did that because she liked the design of the knit. And then a little while back, I actually took the Eureka top and did a little bit of slicing and dicing and decided to use both a jersey knit fabric on the front, and I separated the back into a yoke and a lower portion. So the yoke is in a knit and the lower part of the back is a cotton voile. I added an inverted pleat. I used the cotton voile for the sleeve bands, and I used the cotton voile, a woven, cut on the bias for a binding on the neckline, a more traditional wrapped binding. So this particular how to do this is on our website under blogs, so it's free to you. If you go to our website and click on blog, you'll see an index on the right hand side and you'll see Eureka top, and the tutorial that comes up is called Trend Alert Combination Tees, and it'll show you where to cut this, how deep this is, how to make this inverted pleat, how to do the binding. It gives you all the instructions for cutting the pocket and everything, where to put it on the piece. So if you want to make something that looks much like this, you will find the how to do that free on our website under our blog. So I decided to replicate a similar idea, but this time do a V-neck. So today I'm going to talk to you about how to produce a V-neck. So you start by deciding how deep of a V you want. And I think the best way to do that is to get your tissue paper out, tissue pattern piece, and actually stand in front of a mirror and put the center front on your body. You could pin it if you need to, and you could even pin the shoulder seam to your garment that you have on. And you can look in the mirror and decide that, I think I want the V about here or wherever, and just make a little mark on this pattern piece, in this case the Eureka top pattern piece, of where and how deep you want the V. So then you would actually mark that point on the pattern, and then you would draw a line. This line is going to be slightly curved. I've learned that if you were to just draw a straight line from the shoulder point to that new point, it's not quite as flattering as a very, very subtle curve. And I use our clear hip curve for the drawing of that line. Just finding just a gentle curve. When it's on your body, it looks straight, but it actually has a little bit of a curve to it. Then I draw a 5/8 inch seam line. This is the green line here, and I want finished measurements in order to determine how long I cut the binding. So I have a dot here at my shoulder seam, and that means finished measurement. I've done the same thing on the back, again to the seam line, and I need to measure those finished measurements on the seam line. So I'm going to use my curve runner, which I've talked about in previous videos, and I'm going to measure the front along the seam line to that dot. That measures 8 inches. Then I'm going to measure the back, start on my 0, and measure along the seam line, and the back measures 5 1/4 inches. I add those two figures together, 13 1/4 inches. Because I'm working on half of a pattern, I need to double the measurement for the other half of the garment. So I'm going to multiply that 13 1/4 times 2 to get 26 1/2. Now I don't add seam allowances to this figure. This is going to be the length that I'm going to cut my binding, and I'm going to sew the binding together so that it's in the round, and the seam allowance take up will make this slightly smaller than the actual dimension and circumference of the neck opening, and that's what I want. Now how wide do I want to cut it? So I've decided that a 1/2 inch is about normal width for a binding. Much wider than that, things don't want to lie flat. So 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, those are sort of my 3 different dimensions on the width. But let's use 1/2 inch today. I want to see a 1/2 an inch. A 1/2 an inch is going to go to the back side, and then I'm going to have 2 seam allowances added to that in order to sew to this neckline. So that comes up to 2 1/4 inches wide. Now in previous videos about sewing knits, you've learned that with jersey knits, they curl. And they curl to the right side when you're cutting on the cross grain. I mentioned earlier that you cut on the bias if you're cutting a binding in a woven fabric. But when you're cutting a knit fabric, you want to cut this on the cross grain, because the cross grain is the stretchiest part of the knit fabric, and it's really the same as cutting it on the bias in terms of stretch. So you use much less fabric. If you just have 1/8 of a yard or 1/4 of a yard of fabric, it's plenty of fabric if you're going to contrast it, for example. But you can see that because it's cut on the cross grain, it curls to the right side of the fabric. And look how skinny that becomes. This is really difficult to work with to try to apply to any neckline, and particularly a curved or a V neckline as well. So we use our trusty fusee web, which I've talked about many times. And instead of the normal width of fusee web, I'll cut it in half. So it's just a skinny little 1/8 of an inch width of fusee web. Now, fusee web is a little web of glue, and it's covered with paper. So I'm going to fuse it to the very edge of my binding. So I'm going to take my binding to the ironing surface, and I'm going to put it with the right side down, and I can drag this across my ironing surface so that this roll flattens out and I get a nice clean edge on one side, so that I can apply this fusee web, strip of fusee web, fuse it through the paper on one edge only of the binding, so that then I can fold my binding in half, because I want a double fold on the binding. And now I have half the original width, but the fusee web has settled down the edges. Because this one edge is fused together with one strip of fusee web, now I have something flat and very easy to sew to an edge instead of a curly thing that's just impossible. All right, so we're going to start to sew it on. And first I'm going to start by stay stitching on the seam line through the V. I'm going to stay stitch using a straight stitch, a regular 2.3, 2.4 millimeter stitch length, straight stitch, no zigzag, straight. I'm on the seam line. I've marked my V point of my seam line. So I'm going to stitch from here to the point. If you have a seam here, you're going to stitch to the seam. Some garments have a seam down the center. You're going to stitch to the seam or the point, and you're going to come back up. So this is one continuous line of straight stitches. Now I'm going to clip the garment to that point, very aggressively into that point. You want to be able to pivot this work so that ultimately you're going to be able to stitch this in somewhat of a straight line. So that's the need for the clip. Without the clip, it's impossible to sew it. So I'm going to start at the center back. I've sewn my length of binding together, and the seam is going to go at the center back. And I'm going to start pinning from the center back all the way down to this point. I'm only going to be able to pin 1/2 of this. It's not easy to pin the entire garment. So I'm going to pin and start sewing from there. Now, one thing that I think is important is that I'm going to find the center of this and maybe make a little clip so that I know where the center of the binding is going to end at this V. So I'm going to pin from here to here, from here to the next seam, about a 1-to-1 ratio. I'm not stretching either the binding or the garment. But when I'm sewing from here to here, I have a little less binding than garment. I'm going to give the binding a little bit of a stretch as I sew it so that I'm easing the garment to the binding, and that will help that hug and lie flat around the neck. Now, one little trick that I've learned, this is the best thing I've learned in a long time, is that I want to be sure that what shows for my binding is a pure and even 1/2 of an inch. In order to do that, when I'm sewing the binding, all the raw edges are together. All of my raw edges of the binding are lined with the raw edge of the garment so that my fold is to the left. I'm going to place my presser foot so that the edge of the presser foot is along the folded edge of the binding. Now I know that I want my stitching line to be 1/2 of an inch away from the fold. That's what guarantees my 1/2 inch width in the end that shows. So I'm going to move my needle position to the right and measure with a little seam gauge from the fold to the needle, 1/2 inch. So all I have to do when I sew this on is follow the edge of the presser foot with the fold of the binding, and the needle will do the job. And it may be that the seam allowance varies a little bit. I'm not as interested in a consistent width of seam allowance as I am with a consistent 1/2 of an inch. So there's your little trick. Once you have sewn this to here, you put your needle down, and then you can readjust. You can open this up and begin to align the edge of the binding with this edge and complete it. So again, you're going to sew 1-to-1 ratio to here, and then you're going to have a little more binding, a little less binding than garment to finish it. So center back to center front, pivot, readjust, take a breath, and finish the second side. Now, how do you create the V? All right, so I think I might take this off of the mannequin in a minute, but on the inside of the garment, I'm going to fold the garment. I think I will. It does help, doesn't it? She's going to lose her little shoulder pads here. By the way, we have great shoulder pads here. All right. So the garment gets folded along the center front, or if there's a seam, along the seam. So this is my center fold, and that means my binding is doubled, so to speak, stacked on top of one another. So I can take a straight edge, a ruler, and simply put that along the center front fold and carry it completely into the binding, straight up. In order to do that, I've had to clip the binding, the seam allowance of the binding only, nothing else. That allows that to lie flat and be able to draw and sew from here to here, so everything's in a straight line. That's what creates your little V-neck. This is what it looks like on the outside. This is what it looks like on the inside. Okay, so that is your V-neck. Now, some people will want to top stitch. First of all, I will 3-thread serge the edge of the seam allowance. And you can see I get that seam allowance fairly narrow, about 3/8 of an inch. And I'm using my isocord thread or some really fine thread, 3-thread setup to serge all edges of the together to clean that up. But I've chosen not to top stitch this edge. I like the clean look of this. And I realized after I put it on that with careful steaming and getting that seam allowance towards the garment, that it looks just fine on, and the seam allowance does not roll out. So I think we're good to go on that. But if you choose to top stitch this or cover stitch this, you want to do a straight stitch, not a zigzag or a programmed knit stitch. You want to use a straight stitch And I would sew that about at least 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. Too close creates a little tunnel. So I have learned that I need to sew a little bit further away from the well of the seam than in the past that I used to. So that's some finishing. I think I may go back in and stitch in the ditch in the shoulders and maybe at the center back, just to make sure that seam allowance is settled in, going in towards the garment and doesn't want to roll out. But it certainly is lying flat there, both on and off the garment. So, all right. A couple of things that I want to talk to you about are the combination of sewing with knit fabrics and woven fabrics. And I've done that, as you can see, with the knit in the front and woven in the back. If I'm using something sheer, such as this, I might wear a camisole, some nude undergarments, or I might even underline this with either silk chiffon, silk georgette, or a tricot, or batiste, or voile, and maybe, I think it's really optional depending on the fabric. But sewing this seam, sewing a woven to a jersey can be a little bit fussy because the jersey wants to stretch and the woven does not. So I've learned that I want to sew with the woven fabric on top and the jersey fabric on the bottom next to the feed dogs, so that the feed dogs can carry the fabric and evenly as it feeds through the machine. I'm using a walking foot always, but particularly when I'm sewing on my knits, that keeps things from getting stretched out all of the time. So walking foot, woven on top of knit to stitch that. Also, by the way, when I cut out my jersey to make this jersey is particularly drapey and soft, and I found that I had trouble pinning the tissue to the fabric. It wanted to move the fabric too much, so that then when it relaxed, I realized that my cut edge wasn't even. So I used fabric weights to place the tissue on top of the fabric, and it solved all of that. So no pins when cutting out. Now obviously I use pins when I sew, but for cutting out, weights work just fine. All right, I want to show you some great fabric combinations I've put together for doing this jersey fabric combination. And by the way, we have a sale going on for the next week on all of our knits. The jersey knits, all solid jersey knits, are 20% off. So if you use this code KNIT620 at checkout, you'll get your 20% off. And also the 7 woven fabrics that I'm going to show you today are also on sale. If you're thinking you want to make a garment like this, I cut a yard of the jersey and a yard of the woven. I had a little bit left over from each, but not much. So I think that would be a good number to work with if you're thinking of this sort of combination, yard of each. All right, so we start with this one. These are some beautiful cotton voiles that we've gotten in, and they come from Italy. Everything that comes from Italy, you know, it's just beautiful, I guess. So this is a little bit sheer, but not terribly, in this wonderful arrangement of flowers. I like it with this very pale lavender pink jersey knit. You can tell this is jersey because I don't know if you can see this from back there, but I'm pulling that on the cross grain and it's curling. That's how you can tell it's a jersey. This isn't a voile, but it's a very, very lightweight viscose rayon. I think it even goes with the color on top of it, but I also put it with this more deeper coral color. And then this particular fabric also goes with the one I'm going to show you in a minute, the yellow color as well. But I think that'd be a wonderful combination. Both super drapey. You know, drapey's our friend, I think. And then there's this voile. This one is a cotton and silk. It has 30% silk in it, 70% cotton. It's also from Italy, so it has a really interesting hand to it, really beautiful. Kind of retro in its motif, I think. But I'm pairing it with a French terry. Now, French terry is a fabric that is identified by the fact that it is smooth on the face and it has loops on the back side. So if you think of terry cloth, which is loopy, terry cloth is loopy on both sides, but French terry is only loopy on one side. And even though the smooth side is the face side of the fabric and the loops are on the technically wrong side, and the loops you would be wearing next to your body, I've used this in reverse and I've used it in combination. So I don't think there's any right or wrong to this. I recently made a Brando jacket where I used the face side of the French terry in parts of the garment, and I used the wrong side of the fabric in other parts, and it made a very interesting textural change. So you can use either side. There's some other combinations that I think are really pretty. This one is cotton. This lovely red and blue combination. All cotton, also from Italy. And I've paired it with a jersey in a gorgeous orange red. Lovely combination. I don't know, when summer's here, I'm into color, I guess. It's my time to wear more color. This is a cotton, but a beautiful, I think it's cotton. It's not marked yet. We just got it in. It may have some rayon in it. I'm not really sure. But at any rate, it sort of has the feeling of rayon, sort of has the feeling of cotton. It may be a blend. But anyway, this came from Italy. The source of where we buy our Italian fabrics, he has a very special way of going to Italy, to the mills there, and buying these incredible fabrics, and we are privileged to buy them from him. Anyway, the motif on this reminds me of sort of puzzle pieces, but it is a floral. I think it's very interesting, sort of geometric, not exactly floral, but it's definitely a floral type motif. So I'm pairing that with a beautiful blue jersey. We have so many solid jerseys right now, and you can take advantage. I looked back in our inventory today, and we have like 6 or 7 beautiful mid blues. So lots of variety. Check those out. Another combination for those of us who are redheads and wear the autumn colors. This is a gorgeous paisley, also cotton. I don't know the source of this, but I suspect by where we got it that it's from Etro. We'll find out when we actually, this also just came in, so I don't have the tag on this, but it is on the website. So think of this as a possibility. And I put it with this gorgeous rusty orange jersey. And then, of course, the combination here, this is a beautiful magenta color, and I've combined it with a cotton voile. You notice that I put the pocket in a different place on this version versus this version. With the round neck, I felt like the pocket could be here, but with the V-neck, I thought it was a little bit too complicated up here, so I lowered it, and it worked just fine. The Fusee web was my friend on this. You know, to sew, again, a woven pocket to a jersey, piece of jersey, I applied the Fusee web, fusible web, to the 3 edges of this pocket, fused the pocket in place first, so I didn't have to pin it, because pinning it would have, wouldn't have been able to be straight. So then I could top stitch it very easily using my walking foot, and I had no trouble getting that pocket right on that jersey. All right, so remember the code for the sale on the solid jerseys and the 7 wovens that we have here, knit 620. And so I'm going to review some of the questions that have come in. I think I've addressed some of them as I've gone along here, but let's see. On the V-neck, both the binding and the body seam line are clipped. No, just the binding is clipped. Now the seam line, or the garment is clipped at a separate time, obviously to the dot, but the clipping of the binding is clipping the seam allowance of the binding only at the V. I talk about this quite a bit. One of the selling points of a sewing machine by some dealers is that it has a stretch stitch or a lightning bolt stitch. I wish I could delete that from my sewing machine. I think that's a totally useless stitch. It's a stitch that is too tight, and it does not do what it was intended to do, which is allow a fabric to give and stretch. It's something that is impossible to rip out. you don't have enough time in your life to rip out a seam that's done in a stretch stitch. So use straight stitches, or if you really think you need more stretch to a seam, then you could use a very, very, very small zigzag stitch. But I never even use that. I'm always sewing my knits with straight stitch. And when I'm using the polyester thread, which has a little bit of give, that's enough of a stretch for me. And another question about relating to stay stitching, is it straight stitch or narrow zigzag? Straight stitch for stay stitching. All those S's. Whew. All right. The seam for the neck binding is placed at the center back. A question about what adjustments to the pattern for the pleat in the back on this Eureka. You can refer to our blog on that. Again, go to the blog on our website, sewingworkshop.com, and check out the Eureka top and trend alert combination tees. I talked about the binding cut on the cross grain on a knit, not the bias. Walking feet are important. This person has problems with knit bands lying flat. I'm going to address that subject more carefully next week when I talk about round necklines and the ratio of a binding to a round neckline. I talked about that a little bit here, where this binding is 1-to-1 ratio from the V to the shoulder seam, and then there's a little less binding to garment across the back. But on a round neckline, that's a different ratio. But my sense is, if your bands are not lying flat, that you need to reduce the length of your binding and ease more garment to the binding, and you might be using a binding that's too wide. I think that much past a ½ an inch, your things are likely to get just sort of out of sorts and not lie very flat. The Noto tee that I'm wearing today is a size large. Interestingly enough, Erin made this, and she has broader shoulders than I do. She's taller than I am. Both of us would probably wear a medium, maybe a small in this garment normally, but we wanted it to be more oversized, and so we purposely made it as a large, probably one size bigger than we normally would. So I think that's all the questions for today. I really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next week.